What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? Frank had been sitting in his worn recliner for what felt like hours, staring blankly at the muted TV screen. The hum of the evening news filled the small living room, but his mind was elsewhere, tangled in a fog of doubt and regret. At 67, he felt like a ghost drifting through his own life, invisible and irrelevant in a world that had moved on without him. The once proud factory foreman now shuffled his days in a routine of doctor visits, lonely dinners, and the occasional call from his daughter, who seemed busier than ever. The ache in his knees was nothing compared to the ache in his heart, the nagging thought that his best years were behind him, that he'd been left on the sidelines while the world raced ahead. That night, as the news anchor's voice announced another breakthrough in renewable energy technology, Frank's ears perked up. Elon Musk, the enigmatic billionaire who seemed to defy every expectation about what was possible, was unveiling Tesla's latest innovation, a revolutionary new battery system designed to store clean energy efficiently and affordably. Frank watched the footage of gleaming solar panels and humming battery units, the excitement in Elon's voice cutting through the monotony of Frank's evening. The man on screen looked relentless, fearless, a symbol of daring to dream regardless of the obstacles. For a moment, Frank felt a spark flicker inside, a feeling long dormant, curiosity. Could this really be the kind of change that mattered? Could a new invention like this have any place in the life of a man who had spent years feeling outdated and forgotten? His eyes lingered on Elon's words, "The future belongs to those who refuse to accept limits, who keep pushing no matter the odds." Those words settled deep in Frank's chest, like a gentle nudge. What if this was his invitation to push too? What if the future wasn't just for the young? What if he still had something to offer? Outside, the wind rattled the old windows as the night settled over his quiet neighborhood. Frank leaned forward, an unfamiliar surge of energy warming his bones. He grabbed his phone and typed hesitantly into a search bar, "Tesla battery technology." The screen flooded with articles, videos, and enthusiastic commentary from people all over the country. "Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from," a YouTube host urged. "This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" Frank smiled faintly, feeling a stirring of connection to strangers who shared his quiet hope. For the first time in years, he wondered if he could rewrite the story he'd told himself for so long, that age meant decline, that his best days were behind him. Maybe, just maybe, the moment it all changed was happening right now. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he closed the laptop, the glow of the screen fading into the dim light of his living room. He leaned back, eyes distant, tracing memories as if they were shadows dancing on the walls. Before this moment, before Elon Musk and his Tesla batteries lit a spark in his heart, Frank's life had settled into a quiet routine that sometimes felt like a slow fade. He remembered a time when he was younger, brimming with energy and hope, a man who dreamed not just of a paycheck but of building something lasting. As a kid growing up in Ohio, he had spent endless summer afternoons tinkering in his father's dusty garage. The smell of oil and metal was comfort, the clatter of tools a language he spoke fluently. Back then, he imagined himself an inventor, a creator, someone who could change the world with his hands and mind. But life, with its twists and turns, had taken a different course. The factory job, the steady paycheck, the marriage to Linda. They were all parts of a life that seemed stable and good but slowly squeezed the wild dreams out of him. Linda was gone now, taken by cancer 5 years ago, and with her departure, a piece of Frank's spirit had slipped away too. The house was quieter without her laughter, colder without her touch. His 2 children had grown and moved across the country, wrapped up in their own busy lives, calling less often than he wished. Frank's days now unfolded with the weight of what was lost, missed birthdays, silent dinners, empty chairs around the table. He often sat on the porch, watching neighbors rush by, families hurrying to ball games and barbecues, feeling like a spectator outside a world he once belonged to. There was a photo on the mantel, yellowed with age, a younger Frank, his face bright with hope, standing beside a battered workbench cluttered with wires and tools. That image was a window to a lost self, a man who believed he could still shape his future. But decades of deferred dreams and the slow erosion of time had made that man seem like a stranger. Regret clung to Frank like a shadow. He wished he had spoken more to his children, told Linda he loved her every day, chased his passions before settling into the predictable. What if I had, he whispered to the empty room, the question a ghost that wouldn't let go. His body was not as strong as it used to be. Arthritis gripped his fingers, mornings greeted him with stiff joints, and the doctor's warnings to take it easy echoed in his ears like a command to give up. Society, too, seemed to place him in a category, too old to matter, too worn to innovate. But beneath the weariness, a small ember of yearning remained, buried but not extinguished. And now, Elon Musk's words had stirred that ember, reminding Frank that it wasn't too late to care, to try, to matter again. That night, as he drifted to sleep, Frank clung to a new possibility, that the story of his life might still have chapters unwritten, that he might yet find a way to leave a mark. It wasn't about reclaiming youth but about embracing a new kind of strength, one forged by experience, resilience, and a refusal to fade away quietly. Frank woke up that morning with a restless weight pressing down on his chest. The hope Elon Musk's breakthrough had sparked still flickered inside him, but it wrestled with a host of doubts gnawing at his mind like relentless shadows. Is it too late for me to make a difference, he wondered, staring out the window at the gray dawn breaking over the sleepy town. The memories of past failures and lost chances crowded his thoughts. His daughter's recent words echoed in his ears, "Dad, you should slow down, you're pushing yourself too hard." They weren't just caution, they were a plea grounded in worry. Frank understood that. His body didn't respond like it used to, and the arthritis in his hands flared with every attempt at tinkering. Still, the ache of invisibility was worse. The world around him seemed to assume that at his age, he was done contributing, done dreaming, done changing. The doctor's advice was clear: take it easy, Frank. Don't overdo it. But what did easy mean when every quiet moment was filled with the silence of unfulfilled potential? Frank's inner war wasn't just about his own fears, it was about the skepticism of those around him. Friends had stopped inviting him to community gatherings, unsure if he could keep up. His children's lives were so full that his new ideas sounded like nostalgic ramblings. Even society seemed to whisper that people like him belonged to a different era, a past best remembered but no longer relevant. He turned on the radio as he made coffee, hoping for distraction. A familiar voice caught his attention. It was an interview with Elon Musk, discussing resilience and the relentless pursuit of progress despite setbacks. Elon spoke about failing hundreds of times before success, about ignoring naysayers who said he was too ambitious or too different. "I think it's important to reason from first principles rather than by analogy," Elon said, his voice calm but fierce. "Don't accept the status quo just because it's comfortable. Challenge assumptions." Frank felt those words press into his mind like a challenge. Maybe the status quo was exactly what was holding him back, not his age, not his body, but the stories he told himself about what was possible. He dug deeper into the podcast, listening as Elon described Tesla's new battery tech, how it could store energy longer, reduce dependence on fossil fuels, and transform whole communities. Frank imagined his own house, running on clean, stored energy, a small beacon of change in his quiet town. But the conflict inside him remained. He questioned if he had the skills, the strength, or the courage to try something so new and bold. What if he failed? What if the neighbors laughed? What if his children thought he was wasting time? That afternoon, Frank sat at his old workbench, fingers tracing the worn wood. The tools were familiar, but the project ahead was daunting. He stared at his hands, somewhat unsteady but still capable. The inner battle raged between fear and hope. He remembered another Elon Musk quote he'd read earlier that week. "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Could this be his moment? Could he push through the doubts and take a step toward reclaiming purpose? That evening, Frank wrote a short note to his daughter. He kept it simple, I'm thinking about trying something new. It might not be perfect, but I want to try. I hope you can understand." Sending the message felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like breaking free from chains. As the sun set, Frank stood outside, watching the sky turn pink and orange. The inner war was far from over, but a small glimmer of hope had taken root. Maybe, just maybe, he was ready to fight, not against age or circumstance, but against the limits he had placed on himself. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen window, casting warm light over Frank's modest home. For the first time in a long time, he felt a restless energy humming beneath his skin. The previous days had been a battle. His inner war between fear and hope, but now something else stirred, determination. Inspired by Elon Musk's relentless drive and the promise of Tesla's new battery technology, Frank decided to take a small but bold step. It wouldn't be a grand invention overnight, but it would be a beginning. He started by dusting off the old tools in his garage, a place he hadn't visited in years. The scent of sawdust and metal brought back memories of younger days, when he'd tinker late into the night, dreaming of making a difference. His fingers ached slightly from arthritis, but they still knew the rhythm of work. Frank spread out a few diagrams he had printed from Tesla's website, basic schematics of battery storage systems, simplified for public understanding. He didn't expect to build anything as complex, but he wanted to understand the foundation. He ordered a small kit online: solar panels, batteries, wiring, and converters designed for home use. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get started. Each step felt like a victory. When the package arrived, Frank approached it like a treasure chest, unboxing with care. The parts were small but full of potential. He spent hours reading manuals, watching instructional videos, and planning. The neighbors watched from a distance, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. "Why bother?" one neighbor muttered. "He's too old for this." Frank heard the words but let them wash over him. This project was his rebellion against those dismissals. He began assembling the system piece by piece. The work was slower than it might have been in his youth, but it was deliberate and full of purpose. Each wire connected, each panel positioned on the roof, was a stitch in a new life he was weaving. Day after day, he rose early and worked until sunset, fueled by a quiet resolve. His hands were stiff, and sometimes the frustration threatened to overwhelm him. At night, he would replay Elon Musk's interviews in his head, recalling the billionaire's fearless attitude toward failure and reinvention. "If something's important, you keep going," Elon had said. Frank decided his effort was important. It wasn't just about technology, it was about proving to himself that he still mattered. The day he flipped the switch to power his home with the new battery system was a quiet triumph. The lights glowed steady, powered by the energy stored from the sun. It was imperfect, there were moments when the system faltered, but it worked. More than that, it worked for Frank's soul. His neighbors began to take notice. Some came by with questions, others stopped for casual conversations about what he was doing. A few even asked if they could help or learn how to set up similar systems. Frank felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. The project was no longer just his, it was beginning to spark something in the community. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his daughter, short but meaningful: "Saw your post about the battery project. Proud of you, Dad." For a moment, the years of distance and silence melted away. Frank realized this small change, the decision to try, to build, to keep going, had rekindled more than just electricity in his home. It had reignited connections, hope, and a sense of purpose. That night, as he lay in bed, Frank felt a quiet joy. The moment it all changed was no longer just a possibility. It was happening, one deliberate step at a time. Frank's small battery system was humming quietly in the corner of his garage, a testament to persistence and possibility. Days of fiddling with wires, recalibrating settings, and chasing elusive errors had given way to a steady rhythm of success. The lights in his house glowed with the energy stored by his modest solar panels, and for the first time in years, Frank felt more alive than ever. Word had begun to spread quietly through the neighborhood about the old man with the homemade energy storage system. Curiosity brought visitors, some skeptical, others inspired. Frank welcomed each with a mix of pride and humility, eager to share not just the technology but the story behind it, the story of a man who refused to let age define his worth. One afternoon, a young reporter from the local paper knocked on Frank's door. She was bright-eyed and eager, with a notebook full of questions about the project and its potential impact. As Frank demonstrated how the battery stored energy during the day to power his home at night, she scribbled notes furiously. When the article appeared a week later, it painted Frank not as a relic clinging to the past but as a beacon of resilience and innovation. The headline read, "Local Retiree Sparks Community Energy Revolution." The response was overwhelming. Messages and phone calls flooded Frank's small home, many from strangers who had felt the sting of being too old or too late. They shared their own stories of regret and hope, inspired by Frank's courage to change his story. The most unexpected message came from his daughter, Lisa. After years of strained communication, she reached out with words that made Frank's heart ache with a mix of relief and joy. "Dad, I've been reading about your project. I'm sorry I doubted you. Can we talk?" The barriers that had kept them apart for years began to crumble. Frank invited Lisa over, and over cups of coffee and gentle conversation, they began to bridge the distance time had built. But the breakthrough wasn't just about public recognition or mended relationships. It was about Frank's own transformation, the shift from a man who had felt invisible to one who knew he still had something to offer. Each day, as he checked the battery levels and adjusted the system, Frank felt a growing sense of purpose. The physical aches remained, but they were now overshadowed by an inner strength. He was no longer a passive observer of life but an active participant, pushing boundaries just as Elon Musk had inspired him to do. One evening, as Frank sat alone on his porch watching the stars blink to life, he reflected on the journey. The pain of loss and regret still lingered, but it was no longer a weight dragging him down. Instead, it was a part of the story that had brought him here, to this place of quiet triumph. He thought of Elon's words, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Frank realized that was exactly what he had done. He had chosen hope over despair, action over resignation. The breakthrough was not just in the battery system but in his heart. As the night deepened, Frank felt a profound gratitude. For the chance to start again. For the courage to defy expectations. For the reminder that it was never too late to matter. In that moment, under the vast American sky, Frank knew his life had been changed forever. Frank sat quietly in his favorite chair, the soft glow of the evening sun filtering through the curtains and casting long shadows across the room. The house felt different now, warmer, filled with a subtle energy that wasn't there before. It was a legacy not written in gold or trophies but in the quiet persistence of a man who refused to fade away. Looking back, Frank realized that the moment it all changed wasn't just about Tesla's new battery technology or Elon Musk's words, it was about a choice, a refusal to accept the limits others set for him or that he set for himself. He remembered the early days when doubt gnawed at him, when his children and doctors urged him to slow down, when loneliness threatened to consume his spirit. But he had pushed through, one step at a time, fueled by a fierce desire to prove that age was not a cage. His small battery project had grown into something more than just an experiment. Neighbors asked for advice, local schools invited him to speak about renewable energy, and community groups sought his help in adopting cleaner technologies. Frank's life was no longer a quiet retreat but a beacon of possibility. The message he carried was simple yet powerful. You are never too old to change, to create, to matter. One afternoon, while setting up a workshop for seniors interested in learning about solar power and battery storage, Frank felt the weight of his journey settle deep inside him. He looked around at the eager faces, men and women like himself, some hesitant at first but hungry for knowledge and hope. He realized that his new legacy wasn't just about technology, it was about inspiring others to see their own worth and potential. Frank thought about Elon Musk again, not as a distant figure but as a symbol of radical thinking and fearless reinvention. Elon had sparked the fire, but Frank had fanned it into a flame that warmed his community. He smiled softly, recalling his daughter Lisa's recent visit and the tentative but growing bond between them. Their conversations were no longer guarded but filled with shared dreams and mutual respect. Frank knew that legacy wasn't just about what you built but about the relationships you healed and nurtured. That night, as Frank lay in bed, he reflected on the transformation that had carried him from despair to hope. He realized that his life's true breakthrough was not in the batteries or the solar panels but in the courage to rewrite his story. "I was never too old," he whispered to the darkness. "I was just waiting for permission to matter again." The quiet house around him seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the truth in his words. Outside, the stars shimmered, endless and eternal, reminders that life, like energy, could be stored, transformed, and passed on. Frank closed his eyes with a peaceful smile, ready for whatever new chapters lay ahead. Frank's journey had begun as a quiet rebellion against the shadows of age and doubt, but now it was unfolding into something far greater, a ripple effect that extended beyond his small town and his modest home. The battery system he built was more than a symbol of personal transformation, it was a beacon of hope for a generation often overlooked. News of Frank's project had spread online, shared in forums and social media groups dedicated to renewable energy and senior empowerment. Messages poured in from all corners of the country, stories of people in their 60s, 70s, and beyond who felt invisible and powerless but now saw a new path illuminated by Frank's courage. The ripple grew larger each day. Frank received invitations to speak at community centers, schools, and environmental conferences. His voice, once quiet and uncertain, now carried the weight of experience and determination. He spoke not just about solar panels and batteries, but about the power of refusing to be defined by age or circumstance. His message was clear: change is possible at any stage of life. The limits we feel are often the ones we accept. With each presentation, Frank noticed the faces of those listening, eyes brightening with possibility, shoulders straightening with renewed pride. He was reminded again of Elon Musk's relentless belief in challenging the status quo, and it fueled his resolve. Yet, the ripple effect was not without its challenges. Some critics dismissed Frank's efforts as a novelty, a feel-good story with little practical impact. Others questioned if older adults could keep up with the fast pace of technological change. But Frank met these doubts with quiet strength. He knew firsthand that transformation was messy, slow, and sometimes met with resistance. What mattered was the willingness to try, to persist, to inspire others to try alongside you. One afternoon, Frank was invited to a televised panel discussing renewable energy solutions. Sitting beside experts and young innovators, he shared his story, his struggles, and his small but significant victories. The host asked, "What's the most important lesson you've learned through this journey?" Frank smiled, his voice steady and warm. "That it's never too late to matter, to learn, and to lead. Age is not a limit, it's a perspective waiting to be changed." The panelists nodded, and the audience responded with applause. After the show, Frank received messages from viewers who felt touched by his story, people who had been waiting for a sign to take action in their own lives. Back home, Lisa helped Frank set up a blog where he could share his experiences, tips for senior innovators, and reflections on the emotional journey of reinvention. The blog quickly gained followers, many sharing their own stories of courage and change. Frank's story was becoming a movement, a ripple spreading across communities, reminding everyone that the spark of transformation was within reach, no matter the age. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch, watching the sunset paint the sky with hues of orange and purple, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The ripple he had started was touching lives, building connections, and changing minds. He thought about Elon Musk once more, the man who had sparked this entire journey with his daring vision and refusal to accept limits. Frank understood now that the real game changer wasn't just the technology, it was the mindset, the courage to believe in possibility and act on it. The ripple was proof that when one person chooses to break through their own barriers, they create waves that lift others too. Frank closed his eyes, breathing in the cool evening air, ready to keep pushing forward, knowing that the best was yet to come. The excitement surrounding Frank's project brought new energy to his life, but with growth came unforeseen challenges. As his battery system gained recognition and the ripple effect expanded, Frank found himself navigating not only technical hurdles but also emotional and social obstacles. One morning, a letter arrived from the local power company, stern and bureaucratic. They warned that his homemade battery system, while innovative, violated certain regulations and could pose safety risks if not inspected and certified. The letter was a shock, a cold reminder that change often meets resistance from established systems. Frank felt a knot tighten in his chest. After all the progress, the encouragement, the new purpose he had discovered, the threat of being shut down was crushing. He wrestled with frustration and doubt. Had he overstepped? Was this journey about to be undone? The community he had inspired rallied around him. Neighbors wrote letters of support, petitioned the power company, and organized meetings to discuss ways to accommodate new technologies like Frank's. But bureaucracy was slow, and the process complicated. Meanwhile, Frank's health began to test his resolve. The arthritis in his hands worsened, making the intricate work on the system painful and slow. The doctor reiterated the advice to take it easy, but Frank knew this was no time to give up. Instead, he adapted. He asked for help from a local tech-savvy young man named Jake, who volunteered to assist with the technical aspects while Frank shared his knowledge and vision. Their partnership bridged generations, blending Frank's experience with Jake's modern skills. Together, they redesigned parts of the system to meet safety standards and prepared documentation for inspections. This collaboration deepened Frank's sense of purpose. It wasn't just about proving himself, it was about building community and showing that innovation could be inclusive. But the emotional challenge remained. Frank grappled with feelings of vulnerability. Was he becoming a burden to those around him? Would this fight cost him the fragile peace he had found? One evening, feeling worn, Frank listened to an old Elon Musk interview where Elon spoke candidly about failure and resilience. Failure is an option here, Elon said. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough. Those words gave Frank permission to accept setbacks without losing sight of his mission. He realized that every obstacle was part of the process, a test of his determination, not a sign to quit. Lisa visited that week, sensing his struggle. Over coffee, she reminded him gently, "Dad, you've already changed so much, not just in your life but in others. It's okay to lean on people. You're not alone in this." That reassurance strengthened Frank. He embraced the support around him, recognizing that transformation was not a solo journey but a collective one. As the weeks passed, the power company's inspectors came and went, impressed by the thoroughness and care in the updated system. Slowly, approvals came through, and Frank's battery project was deemed safe and compliant. The victory was bittersweet, hard-won and marked by moments of doubt, but it reaffirmed the core lesson Frank had learned: courage was not the absence of fear or difficulty, but the willingness to face them head-on. The unexpected challenges strengthened Frank's resolve and deepened his gratitude for the community that stood by him. He knew the path ahead would still have obstacles, but now he had the tools and support to keep moving forward. Sitting on his porch one clear night, Frank looked up at the stars with a quiet smile. The challenges were real, but so was the power to overcome them. Like Tesla's new batteries, life's energy could be stored, tested, and released again, stronger, brighter, and ready to light the way. The days after the power company's approval brought a new wave of energy to Frank's life. The fight had been tough, but the victory was sweeter because it was shared. More than the technical triumph, Frank felt a growing warmth in his heart, an unexpected rekindling of relationships long dormant. Lisa, his daughter, had become a steady presence again, visiting regularly to help with the blog and community workshops. Their conversations no longer tiptoed around old wounds but explored hopes, dreams, and the future. One Saturday afternoon, while setting up solar panels for a neighbor, Frank received a surprise phone call from his old friend, Paul. They hadn't spoken in over a decade, their friendship strained by time, misunderstandings, and the silence that grows in the gaps of lost years. "I saw the article about your project," Paul said, his voice tentative but warm. "I'm proud of you, Frank. I'd like to catch up, if you're willing." Frank felt a swell of emotion. The past's weight was still there, but the possibility of rebuilding was stronger. They agreed to meet at their favorite diner, a place filled with memories of laughter and shared struggles. The reunion was awkward at first, but as coffee cups emptied and stories flowed, the walls came down. Paul spoke of his regrets, his own battles with feeling left behind, and the ways Frank's journey inspired him to rethink his own life. Frank realized that his transformation was not only personal but rippling out, touching the lives of those who had drifted away. This reconnection was a gift, a reminder that it was never too late to heal what time had fractured. As the weeks went on, Frank and Paul began volunteering together, bringing renewable energy education to local seniors and students alike. Their combined energy ignited new projects, new friendships, and a renewed sense of purpose. Frank also found himself reaching out to others he had lost touch with, mending relationships strained by years of silence and distance. Each conversation was a step toward forgiveness and understanding, healing not just past wounds but the fear of being forgotten. Meanwhile, Lisa took the blog in new directions, featuring stories from other seniors who had found new purpose through technology and innovation. The platform became a gathering place for a community eager to rewrite their narratives. Frank often marveled at how far he'd come, from isolation and doubt to connection and influence. He thought again of Elon Musk's fearless pursuit of the impossible and how that mindset had sparked his own transformation. But now, Frank knew that courage was also about vulnerability, about reaching out and accepting support. One evening, as Frank sat by the fireplace, he penned a letter to Lisa, expressing his gratitude and hopes for their renewed bond. "I was lost for so long," he wrote, "but your belief in me gave me the strength to find myself again. Together, we're building more than a project, we're building a legacy." The letter was more than words, it was a testament to the healing power of connection and the new beginnings that come when we dare to open our hearts. As Frank prepared for another community talk, he felt a deep peace. The journey was far from over, but with each step, he was crafting a life rich with purpose, love, and possibility. In the twilight, under a sky filled with stars, Frank smiled. The past was behind him, the future bright, and the present, a gift to be embraced fully, was his to shape. Frank's journey was no longer a quiet personal rebellion but a visible movement growing stronger with each passing day. The victories, small and large, had fueled his spirit, but he understood now that lasting change demanded more than a spark. It required persistence, a steady willingness to face obstacles, doubts, and even failures head-on. One morning, as Frank adjusted the settings on his battery system, he received an unexpected call from a state energy grant office. They were interested in supporting community-led renewable energy projects, particularly those involving seniors and underserved populations. The news was exhilarating and daunting all at once. Securing the grant could expand Frank's impact far beyond his neighborhood. But the application process was complex, filled with forms, technical jargon, and deadlines that threatened to overwhelm him. Frank felt a familiar surge of anxiety. Could he really navigate this bureaucratic maze? Would his age and limited tech skills hold him back? Yet, the memory of Elon Musk's relentless focus on problem-solving came to mind. Elon didn't wait for perfect conditions or guaranteed success, he tackled challenges one step at a time. Inspired, Frank reached out to Lisa and Jake for help. Lisa, with her writing skills, crafted a compelling grant proposal, weaving their story of transformation with data and community support. Jake handled the technical details, ensuring the proposal met every requirement. Their teamwork rekindled Frank's belief in the power of collaboration across generations. As they worked, Frank experienced moments of frustration and doubt. The process was tedious, and setbacks emerged, a missing document here, a misunderstood guideline there. But each time, Frank remembered Elon's words, when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. He refused to give up. Weeks later, the grant was approved. The funding meant new solar panels, battery kits, and educational materials for seniors in neighboring towns. It was a milestone that validated Frank's vision and resilience. With the grant secured, Frank expanded his workshops, traveling to community centers and retirement homes to teach others about renewable energy and the possibilities it held. The joy in the faces of participants, some skeptical at first but quickly transformed by hands-on learning, was priceless. Frank saw reflections of his own journey in their eyes: fear, hope, uncertainty, and finally, empowerment. One woman, Ruth, shared how Frank's story inspired her to start a community garden powered by solar energy. Another, Jim, used the lessons to install solar panels on his small farm, reducing costs and supporting sustainability. These ripple effects deepened Frank's sense of purpose. He was not just teaching technology, he was fostering a mindset of resilience and possibility. Yet, persistence was tested again when a severe storm damaged several solar panels in a nearby town. The setback threatened to undo months of work and hope. Frank coordinated with volunteers to repair the damage, refusing to let the storm halt their progress. Through these trials, Frank learned that persistence wasn't about never facing failure, it was about rising every time you fell. As he looked out over the repaired panels shimmering in the sun, he felt a surge of pride and gratitude. His journey mirrored the energy his batteries stored, sometimes drained, sometimes recharged, always ready to power what came next. Frank's story became a beacon for many seniors who saw in him proof that age was no barrier to making a difference. The community's embrace and the growing network of support reminded him daily that transformation was possible for everyone willing to persevere. Sitting on his porch one evening, Frank gazed at the stars and thought about Elon Musk's vision, not just for technology but for human potential. Persistence, Elon had said, is the fuel that powers innovation. Frank felt that truth in every bone, every breath, and every heartbeat. He smiled, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the power to change was in his hands and in the hands of those he inspired. Frank sat quietly in his workshop, surrounded by solar panels, wires, and battery cells, the hum of technology mingling with the soft ticking of a wall clock. The familiar rhythm was comforting, yet his mind churned with a restless energy, a mix of excitement and fear. The success of his renewable energy project had opened doors, but now new opportunities demanded stepping further outside his comfort zone. Invitations came from unexpected places: a regional environmental summit, a tech innovation conference, even a podcast featuring senior entrepreneurs. Each offered a chance to share his story and vision with a wider audience, but also challenged him to face unfamiliar crowds and settings. The thought of public speaking stirred old insecurities. For years, Frank had avoided the spotlight, preferring quiet solitude to the anxiety of performance. Now, however, he saw that embracing the unknown was the next step in his transformation. Elon Musk's fearless approach echoed in his mind: if you're not failing, you're not innovating enough. That meant courage wasn't the absence of fear but the willingness to move forward despite it. Frank began small, practicing his talks at home, rehearsing in front of Lisa and Jake. Their encouragement built his confidence, yet the real test came with his first public appearance at a local community center. The room was filled with curious faces: seniors, young adults, environmentalists, each eager to hear about the man who had turned his life around through renewable energy. Frank's voice trembled at first, but as he shared his story, the regrets, the doubts, the breakthroughs, a calm strength settled over him. He spoke not just about technology but about the power of persistence, hope, and reinvention. The audience responded with warm applause, and after the talk, several people approached him, sharing their own struggles and dreams. That night, as Frank lay in bed, he realized the profound impact of stepping into the unknown. Each challenge was an opportunity to grow, to connect, and to inspire. He thought about Elon Musk's bold ventures, from electric cars to rockets, each a leap into uncertainty fueled by vision and grit. Inspired, Frank accepted the invitation to the regional summit. Traveling outside his hometown was a new adventure, a test of his resilience and adaptability. The conference center buzzed with energy, filled with innovators and thought leaders. Frank felt a surge of nervousness but also excitement. On stage, he told his story with authenticity and passion, his message resonating with people across generations. Questions flowed, and Frank answered with honesty, acknowledging his fears and the journey to overcome them. The experience deepened his belief that age was not a limitation but a vantage point rich with wisdom and potential. Back home, Frank received invitations from other communities and organizations eager to learn from his experience. The ripple effect expanded, carrying his message across towns and states. Yet, amidst the growing recognition, Frank stayed grounded, reminding himself that true transformation was an ongoing process, not a destination. Embracing the unknown meant accepting uncertainty as a constant companion, a catalyst for growth rather than a threat. One evening, as Frank sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Lisa joined him. They spoke about the future, plans for new workshops, potential partnerships, and the dream of creating a network of senior innovators. Frank smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey that began with a single spark had evolved into a movement, powered by courage, persistence, and the willingness to embrace the unknown. He thought again of Elon Musk's words, feeling them as a personal mantra. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. For Frank, those words were no longer just inspiration, they were a lived truth guiding every step forward. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank's renewed confidence from embracing the unknown carried him into new realms of possibility. His story was no longer just about personal transformation, it was becoming a beacon, a light guiding others who felt dimmed by age, doubt, or circumstance. One crisp autumn morning, Frank received a call that would deepen his impact in unexpected ways. A regional nonprofit focused on senior empowerment invited him to lead a pilot program combining renewable energy education with life skills workshops for older adults. The program aimed to ignite purpose, community, and self-sufficiency, and Frank was thrilled to bring his experience to this broader platform. As planning began, Frank knew this was more than a teaching opportunity, it was a chance to foster real change. He reached out to Lisa, Jake, and Paul, forming a core team ready to support the initiative. Together, they designed workshops that blended practical skills with inspiration, ensuring participants not only learned about solar power and batteries but also explored themes of resilience, reinvention, and legacy. The first session was held in a modest community center filled with eager faces, some skeptical, some curious, all hungry for connection. Frank started by sharing his story honestly, the fears, the failures, and the breakthroughs. His vulnerability broke down walls and sparked conversations that extended beyond technology. Participants shared their own struggles with feeling irrelevant or forgotten, and Frank listened with empathy, reminding them, "You are not alone. Every day is a chance to light a new path." The workshops evolved into something more profound than Frank had imagined. They became gatherings where seniors found not just knowledge but community, a place to rediscover purpose and hope. One woman, Mary, had long battled loneliness and loss. Through the program, she found the courage to organize a neighborhood solar co-op, bringing affordable energy and friendship to her street. Another participant, George, reignited his passion for carpentry by building solar panel mounts, blending old skills with new technology. Frank marveled at how the spark he had lit was igniting flames everywhere. Yet, the journey was not without its challenges. Some participants struggled with technology's pace, while others wrestled with the emotional weight of past regrets. Frank and his team worked patiently, adapting the program to meet diverse needs, proving that transformation required flexibility and compassion. As the pilot program gained success, word spread, and other communities expressed interest in adopting the model. Frank found himself invited to speak at regional conferences and collaborate with organizations dedicated to senior innovation and sustainability. The ripple effect he had started was growing, carried by the stories and successes of those he helped empower. One evening, after a long day of workshops, Frank sat with Lisa on the porch, reflecting on how far they'd come. "I never imagined this," he said quietly. "That my journey would become a light for so many." Lisa smiled, squeezing his hand. "You're not just lighting the way, Dad. You're showing what's possible when we refuse to fade quietly." Frank thought of Elon Musk again, the visionary who dared to think differently, to push boundaries regardless of doubt or fear. Musk's radical mindset had sparked Frank's own transformation, but now Frank realized the true power lay in sharing that spark, lighting fires in others. As the sun set, casting golden light across the town, Frank felt a deep peace. His journey was a testament to the idea that purpose doesn't diminish with age, it evolves, grows brighter, and reaches further. In the quiet, he whispered a promise to himself, to keep lighting the way for those ready to follow. The ripple was now a wave, unstoppable, radiant, and full of possibility. Frank's growing influence and expanding programs brought not only praise but also new challenges. As word spread about his work empowering seniors through renewable energy, he encountered skepticism and criticism from unexpected places. One afternoon, while setting up for a workshop, Frank received a call from a local newspaper journalist who wanted to interview him but warned, "There are some in the community who question whether seniors can really contribute to innovation. They think it's a nice story, but not realistic." Frank sighed, feeling the sting of that dismissive attitude. He had faced self-doubt and societal invisibility before, but hearing it echoed back in others' voices was painful. Yet, it also sparked a familiar fire. This was the kind of challenge Elon Musk often faced, dismissal by critics who couldn't see past their own limitations. Frank remembered Elon's tenacity: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Determined, Frank decided to address the doubts head-on. He prepared for the interview with honesty and conviction, sharing not only his successes but also the struggles and setbacks that had shaped his journey. He emphasized the value of experience, resilience, and community support in driving meaningful change, no matter one's age. The interview was published with the headline, "At 67, Frank Powers proves age is no barrier to innovation." It sparked conversations across the town, some supportive, some skeptical, but most importantly, it opened a dialogue. Encouraged by the response, Frank organized a public forum titled "Innovation at Every Age," inviting seniors, young professionals, local leaders, and critics to engage in honest discussion. The event was packed, buzzing with energy and varied perspectives. Frank shared his story and invited others to speak about their experiences with aging, change, and possibility. Some seniors told of being underestimated and dismissed, while younger attendees expressed surprise at the skills and wisdom their elders brought. The forum became a powerful exchange, breaking down stereotypes and building bridges. Even some of the harshest doubters admitted they had underestimated the potential of seniors. Frank's leadership and vulnerability had shifted minds. Afterward, Frank received messages from seniors who felt inspired to pursue their own dreams and from younger people eager to learn and collaborate. The barriers of age and expectation began to crumble. Yet, Frank knew this was an ongoing battle. Society's biases didn't vanish overnight, and every day brought new moments to challenge the status quo. He leaned on Lisa, Jake, and Paul, whose support grounded him during tougher times. One evening, Frank reflected on how Elon Musk's journey had mirrored his own in many ways: the critics, the failures, the relentless belief in the vision. Musk's example had taught Frank that courage wasn't about never facing doubt but about refusing to let it define you. Frank decided to write an open letter to the community, published in the local paper, titled "Why We All Matter, No Matter Our Age." In it, he spoke with heartfelt urgency about the strength found in diversity, the power of experience, and the shared responsibility to uplift one another. The letter resonated widely, further cementing Frank's role as a leader and catalyst. As the months passed, Frank's work gained momentum, and he saw tangible change, not just in renewable energy adoption but in the community's mindset about aging and contribution. Frank's story became proof that doubters could be turned into allies when met with openness, resilience, and truth. Sitting on his porch one evening, Frank watched the stars shimmer in the night sky. The path had not been easy, but each doubt faced was another step toward breaking barriers and lighting new possibilities. He smiled, feeling a deep gratitude for the journey and a renewed commitment to keep pushing forward. Like Tesla's new battery technology powering a future once thought impossible, Frank's own energy was fueling a transformation that was only just beginning. The air was crisp that morning as Frank stepped outside, a light breeze rustling the trees, sunlight dancing across the solar panels in his yard. The landscape had changed, not just around his home, but within his own life. What began as a personal spark, a challenge to himself to prove he was not finished, had become something far greater than he'd imagined. He could feel it now, a legacy in motion. The workshops had expanded beyond the region, and the original blog Lisa helped him build was now a digital hub for senior-led energy initiatives across the country. People were sharing photos of their DIY battery systems, garden co-ops powered by rooftop panels, and classrooms where retirees were mentoring students on sustainability and engineering. Frank spent his mornings reading those messages, sometimes with tears welling in his eyes. Not sadness, but a fierce joy. Proof that the fight had been worth it. That what he built mattered. Not just the battery system in his shed, but the belief that age was not a wall, but a window waiting to be opened. Still, the work continued. Frank was working with a nearby technical college to help develop a formal curriculum, empowered later in life, combining renewable energy education with emotional resilience, practical problem-solving, and intergenerational collaboration. He was invited to sit on an advisory panel for statewide clean energy adoption. A younger version of himself would have laughed at the idea of him, a retired machinist in his late 60s, sitting beside policymakers and tech executives. But he didn't feel out of place now. He felt ready. One day, after wrapping up a webinar with a senior center in Arizona, Frank received a package. Inside was a letter and a small bronze plaque. The letter was from a group of high school students in Detroit, thanking him for inspiring them to start a youth-senior partnership on solar innovation. They had named their new lab after him, the Frank Powers Innovation Garage. Frank held the plaque for a long moment, the weight of it grounding him in place. He had started this journey alone, uncertain, and honestly afraid. Now, his name was etched into a space where others would chase possibility. That night, he sat on the porch with Lisa, the two of them wrapped in blankets, sipping tea, gazing out at the solar lights twinkling along the path to the workshop. "You know," Lisa said softly, "I used to worry that you were just trying to fill the silence. That maybe this whole thing was about avoiding something. But now I see you've become someone else entirely. Or maybe someone you've always been, and just forgot for a while." Frank smiled, nodding slowly. "I think I did forget. For a long time. I thought I'd already written all the chapters of my life that mattered. But I was wrong. I was waiting for the world to tell me I still mattered, when what I really needed was to tell that to myself." Lisa rested her head on his shoulder, and they sat in silence, letting the moment stretch. Later that week, Frank spoke at a youth conference where he met a 17-year-old named Caleb who reminded him so much of himself, curious, unsure, full of ideas but uncertain about how to begin. After Frank's talk, Caleb approached him and said, "It's just. I don't know where to start. I'm afraid I'll mess up." Frank chuckled softly, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then you're already doing it right. The key is to begin anyway. The mistakes are part of the map." That exchange stayed with him. It reminded him that legacies weren't built only in steel and circuits and grants. They were passed on in quiet moments, conversations, shared truths, open hands reaching across fear. At home that evening, Frank scrolled through an old email inbox he hadn't opened in years. One message caught his eye, it was from his late wife's sister, Mary. They hadn't spoken since the funeral, when grief had created distance neither side knew how to bridge. He opened the message. It was brief but heartfelt. "I've seen what you've done, Frank. I just wanted to say I think she'd be proud of you. I know I am." The words landed like a warm stone in his chest, heavy but comforting. He replied simply, "Thank you. I think I'm finally learning how to live again. Not just survive." That night, he walked into his workshop, the space that had once felt like a hiding place but now pulsed with the energy of creation and purpose. He looked over the panels, the tools, the in-progress guides he was drafting for the new mentorship program. On the wall hung a quote from Elon Musk that he'd printed and framed early in his journey: "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." Frank knew now that the disaster wasn't global warming or bureaucracy or aging bodies, it was the quiet surrender to irrelevance. He had turned his own life from a slow fading into a blazing arc of purpose. And he wasn't done yet. That same week, Jake approached Frank with an idea. "What if we open this workshop as a maker space?" he said. "Invite kids, seniors, anyone who wants to build something, solar, mechanical, whatever. You lead it. I'll handle the logistics." Frank's heart leapt. The idea was perfect. It was the next phase, a physical space where knowledge and energy would be shared and multiplied. "Let's do it," he said without hesitation. "Let's build the place where no one feels too young to start or too old to begin again." Construction began in the spring, renovating the back of Frank's workshop into an open, sunlit studio filled with benches, tools, panels, wires, soldering kits, and diagrams. Above the entrance, Frank painted the words himself, "The Possibility Room." That summer, the first group arrived, young kids with wild ideas, seniors with quiet hands and brilliant minds. Side by side, they learned, tinkered, failed, rebuilt. Laughter echoed, sparks flew, and ideas took root. Frank moved among them slowly, hands still a bit stiff, heart wide open. He was no longer a man trying to prove he still mattered. He was a man helping others remember that they always had. The legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was being lived, daily, loudly, and with the kind of power no battery could ever store. It happened on a Tuesday, quiet at first, like most disruptions. Frank was walking back from the community garden when his neighbor, June, called out from her porch, "Power's out." Everywhere. He looked up. No hum of air conditioners, no streetlights flickering on as dusk settled. Just an eerie stillness, the kind that made people pause and listen. Within minutes, messages began pouring in. The local grid had failed, again. A transformer issue miles away had triggered rolling blackouts, hitting towns across the county. People panicked. Grocery stores shut down. Refrigerators warmed. Medications were at risk. Some sat in the dark, unsure of what to do. Frank stood in his kitchen, the light from the windows fading fast, and for a moment, he just listened. He'd lived through these moments before, storms, outages, emergencies, but something felt different this time. This time, he wasn't powerless. He stepped into the backyard and flipped a single switch. The solar battery system he had built, tested, and improved over the past year kicked in with a low, steady hum. Lights came on in the shed. The fridge buzzed back to life. Devices started charging. And before he could pour himself a glass of water, neighbors were knocking. "Frank, is your power still on?" one asked. "Is that from your system?" another whispered, almost in disbelief. Frank nodded. "Yeah. Want me to set you up?" Within the hour, extension cords ran from his workshop to 3 nearby homes, powering medical devices, charging phones, running fans. He pulled out extra battery kits from storage and called Jake and Paul. They loaded up the truck and drove across town, dropping off mobile panels and backup units to the senior center and a small daycare that had gone dark. By morning, the news was reporting the outage would last for days. While emergency services scrambled, Frank and his team already had temporary power stations up and running in over a dozen homes. What had begun as a personal project had become a lifeline. At the community center, Ruth hugged him with tears in her eyes. "Frank, you don't understand what this means. Without the backup, I would have had to leave my home. I didn't know how I was going to keep my insulin cold." His voice cracked when he answered. "This is why we built it. For moments like this." As word spread, more volunteers joined. Seniors who had taken Frank's workshops became leaders in their own neighborhoods, showing others how to manage power loads, install panels, and monitor battery levels. They weren't just being helped, they were helping. And that changed everything. The local news caught on quickly. A reporter visited Frank's home, walking through the buzzing workshop, the humming battery walls, the organized shelves of solar kits and spare inverters. "You've created a microgrid here," the reporter said. "Did you ever imagine something like this?" Frank smiled, weary but proud. "I imagine surviving. This is thriving." The segment aired that night, and within 24 hours, Frank was contacted by a statewide energy task force. They asked him to consult on a new initiative focused on resilience hubs, community-led spaces that could operate independently during crises. Frank accepted, not for the recognition, but because he had lived through the alternative. He had watched people sit in silence, waiting for help that came too late or not at all. That would never happen again, not if he could help it. Meanwhile, Lisa turned the experience into a live story series, hosting community voices, gathering testimonials, and archiving how seniors had become the unexpected heroes of the blackout. "Dad," she told him one evening, "you didn't just flip a switch. You flipped the whole narrative about what aging means." Frank didn't respond right away. He was watching a little girl from down the street ride her bike past the house, her mother waving from the sidewalk. Their home had been dark during the first night of the blackout. Now, it was lit, cooled, and safe, thanks to the power cords that had snaked out of Frank's garage. He finally said, "I think we all just needed permission to believe we could still matter." Elon Musk's words returned to him again, not in a flashy headline but in the quiet echo of persistence: people should pursue what they're passionate about. That will make them happier than pretty much anything else. Passion. That was the key. Not youth. Not talent. Passion and purpose. And the guts to keep going when no one was watching. When the power grid finally came back online, it didn't feel like the lights had returned, it felt like they'd caught up. Frank's home, and now dozens of others, had proven something powerful: change could start small and still ripple outward like electricity through a newly lit wire. He stood in the middle of his workshop that night and stared at the wall of battery units glowing steady green. The silence around them was peaceful, not powerless. A soft, persistent hum like a heartbeat. The power was back, but Frank had never lost his. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to lead not from behind or beneath, but from within. Not because of a title, or money, or youth, but because of belief. In the future. In others. In himself. Autumn crept back into town like an old friend, cooler mornings, leaves crunching underfoot, skies soft with early dusk. After the blackout and all the media attention, things settled into a quieter rhythm again. Frank welcomed the stillness. But in the silence, something unexpected stirred. Not regret. Not exhaustion. Something older. Something deeper. Grief. It came one night without warning. He was sorting through old files in the workshop, looking for a diagram Jake had drawn on insulation placement, when he found a photo wedged between two manuals. It was him and Evelyn, his late wife, sitting on the front porch, a summer day, lemonade glasses in hand, her laughter frozen in time. He hadn't seen that picture in years. It stopped him cold. For a long moment, he didn't move. The photo curled slightly at the edges, the ink faded just enough to soften the image like a dream. He sat down at the workbench, holding it between calloused fingers, and suddenly the hum of the workshop faded. The silence was louder than the blackout had ever been. It filled his chest like a weight, a gravity pulling him back into the years he'd buried. Not because he wanted to forget, but because remembering had once hurt too much. The journey he'd been on, reinventing himself, building something meaningful, had given him purpose, yes. But Evelyn had been missing from every step, and that void had always been there, waiting. That night, he didn't work. Didn't write. Didn't plan. He sat on the porch where the photo had been taken and just let himself miss her. Truly miss her. The next morning, Lisa noticed. "You okay, Dad?" she asked, gently. He nodded, but it wasn't a lie or a mask. It was a different kind of okay. The kind that comes after a long cry, or a night of deep, painful memory. "I just remembered how much she believed in me," he said softly. "Even when I didn't." Lisa sat beside him and put her head on his shoulder. "She'd love what you've done here. What you've become." "I think," Frank said, voice tight, "I've only just realized, this wasn't just about building a new life. It was about keeping a promise. Even if I didn't know I was making one." Lisa didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence this time wasn't hollow. It was full of love, of memory, of healing. Over the next few days, Frank began something new, not another battery prototype or solar guide, but a letter. To Evelyn. Not meant for anyone else. Just a quiet reckoning with all he'd carried and all he still wished she could have seen. In the letter, he wrote about the first time he saw her, the way her smile had always been his true north. He wrote about the lonely years after she passed, and the emptiness that had almost swallowed him. Then he wrote about the spark, how Elon Musk's wild ideas had jolted him awake. How a single quote about never giving up had pushed him to try. To fail. To try again. He wrote about Lisa, Jake, Paul. About the neighbors now running on solar, the kids in the maker space, the plaque from Detroit. And he ended it with one simple sentence: "I'm finally becoming the man you always saw in me." When he finished, he folded the letter, walked to the tree where Evelyn's ashes were scattered, and buried it beneath a stone. No fanfare. No speech. Just a private moment to complete a chapter that had remained open far too long. After that, something shifted. Not dramatically, but gently. Like the way light changes through stained glass. He started smiling more. Not to cover pain, but because the pain had found its place. It was no longer a shadow. It was a part of the landscape, woven into everything he'd built. Frank began incorporating reflection sessions into his workshops. Not just how to, but why do. He encouraged people to write letters to their past selves, their younger dreams, their regrets. Some read them aloud. Others cried in silence. The community grew stronger for it. One man, Harold, who'd spent 20 years feeling useless after retirement, stood in front of the group and said, "I didn't know it was okay to start over at 72. Frank showed me it's not just okay, it's necessary." Frank nodded. It's never too late to begin again. And sometimes, starting again doesn't mean becoming someone new. It means remembering who you always were. These weren't just workshops anymore. They were awakenings. Reunions with the self. Frank started calling the series, Power Within, a nod to both the battery systems and the emotional reserves people forgot they had. He even created a companion journal, filled with prompts, exercises, and quotes from unlikely heroes, many of them seniors who'd stepped up during the blackout. In the front of each journal was a dedication, to those who think their story is over. It's not. It's just getting interesting. As fall deepened and the leaves turned fire orange and crimson, Frank was invited to speak at a national summit on community resilience. He hesitated. The old part of him still questioned whether he belonged in a room full of CEOs, engineers, and policy makers. But then he remembered the photo. Evelyn's smile. The letter. And the silence that had finally turned from ache to answer. He said yes. On the flight to Denver, he stared out the window, clouds drifting below like slow-moving thoughts. He felt nervous, sure, but also grounded. Rooted. Ready. On stage, in front of hundreds, he told his story from the beginning. The fading. The spark. The building. The blackout. The photo. The letter. I didn't do all this because I had time, he said near the end. I did it because I ran out of excuses. Because if I didn't start, I'd have to live with knowing I never tried. He paused. Looked out at the faces watching him. Some young, some older, all leaning in. You're never too old to change. You're just waiting for permission. And maybe that permission has to come from you. When he stepped down from the podium, the applause was loud, but it was the quiet nods that meant the most. The man in the back wiping his eyes. The woman in the wheelchair mouthing, "Thank you." The teenager scribbling down notes. Later that night, back in his hotel room, Frank took out his notebook and jotted down one more thought before bed. It turns out silence isn't the end. It's where the next sound begins. The first snow came early that year, powdering the rooftops and outlining every bare branch in soft white. Frank awoke to a world hushed and beautiful, the kind of morning that demanded you slow down and pay attention. From his porch, he could see the familiar grid of homes, some now outfitted with panels he'd helped install, others still waiting for that next step. He sipped his coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up in the cold. He'd been home from the summit in Denver for 2 weeks, and the quiet after such a high-energy event was both welcome and strange. Something lingered from that trip, an idea, half-formed and buzzing at the edges of his thoughts. A moment from the conference had stayed with him. It had come from a casual conversation during a lunch break, with a woman named Nadia, an engineer and professor working with underserved urban communities. She'd said, "It's not just the tech that changes lives, it's who gets access to it." That line echoed through Frank's mind like a bell. He'd spent so much time helping people who came to him, who were willing, ready, hopeful. But what about those who weren't any of those things yet? What about the people who didn't see a future because life had taken too much already? The ones who didn't even know they had something left to ignite? That question dug deep. So deep, in fact, that Frank picked up the phone and called Jake. "I've got a wild idea," he said. Jake's response was automatic. "I'm in." Over the next several weeks, they worked on a plan, not for a new battery design or a neighborhood solar project, but for something different, a mobile workshop. A van, retrofitted with basic solar kits, simple tools, batteries, and educational materials. The goal was simple: go to the people who would never come to them. Bring the power, literally and figuratively, to forgotten places. Abandoned motels now used as transitional housing. Retirement homes where residents sat in wheelchairs staring at static-filled TVs, small towns bypassed by innovation and investment. It took a month to find the van, a dented old Sprinter with fading paint and a stubborn engine. Frank smiled when he saw it. "She's perfect." They gutted the back and rebuilt it from the ground up, custom shelving, a fold-out bench, charging stations, display panels. On the outside, Lisa designed a bold wrap, "The Power Within" project in bright orange and white letters, with the tagline beneath it, "You're never too old, and it's never too late." When the van was finally ready, Frank stood back and looked at it like a proud parent. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't polished. But it was real. It was ready. Their first stop was a former manufacturing town 30 miles south, where the last factory had shut down in 2011. The downtown strip was mostly boarded up, and the senior center had more volunteers than participants. Because most people didn't see the point in showing up. Frank parked the van out front, stepped out with a coil of wire slung over his shoulder, and smiled. "Let's see who's still listening," he said. Inside the center, a few people stirred as he and Jake rolled in a battery module and a sample solar panel. One man grumbled, "We don't need more toys. We need jobs." Frank nodded. "I know. But what if this could give you a reason to teach someone? What if it was less about the toy and more about the torch?" That line landed differently. Slowly, people gathered. They were wary but curious. Frank didn't lecture. He shared. He asked questions. He invited them to tell him how they used to wire circuits back in the day. What machines they'd fixed. What ideas they'd once had but never acted on. By the end of the session, a small group lingered. They helped solder a wire into place. Adjusted panel angles. One woman, May, who had been silent most of the day, quietly asked if she could take one of the mini battery kits home. "I've got a grandson who always breaks stuff. Maybe he can break this, then help fix it." Frank smiled. That's exactly the point. Over the next several weeks, the van became a familiar sight in places where nothing new usually showed up. Sometimes it sparked conversations. Sometimes it just brought light to a dim hallway. But in every stop, Frank saw the same thing: people who had been convinced they were on the sidelines, suddenly leaning in again. One man in a veterans rehab facility cried when the lights flickered on from a panel he'd helped wire. "I haven't built anything in 20 years, he said, voice trembling. "I forgot what that felt like." Frank nodded. "Feels like coming back, doesn't it?" But the work wasn't always easy. In one community, they were met with suspicion. "Why now?" someone snapped. "Why'd it take so long for someone to show up?" Frank didn't try to argue. He let them vent. Then he simply said, "You're right. It took too long. But we're here now. And I can't undo the past. I can only help build something different today." That day ended quietly, but a week later, Frank got a call. A few of the residents had started tinkering with the guides he left behind. They wanted more kits. And they had ideas. Frank grinned when he hung up. Sparks in strange places. That's what this was. It wasn't about saving people, it was about reminding them of what was still inside. What had always been inside. One night, after a long day of driving, Jake and Frank camped outside a remote reservation town where the school had just installed its first solar panel. The stars were breathtaking, endless, and silent. Jake leaned back in his chair. "Did you ever think it would go this far?" Frank shook his head. "I didn't think I'd even make it this far." He looked out into the dark. "But maybe this is what it means to really be alive. To know your hands still work, your voice still matters, your ideas still carry weight." Jake tossed a log into the fire. "You're not just bringing energy to these places, Frank. You're bringing something people lost a long time ago." "Hope?" Frank asked. "No," Jake said. "Dignity." Frank didn't reply. He just let the fire crackle and the stars witness the truth. The Power Within project wasn't about electricity. It was about remembering you had something to give. Something no blackout, no failure, no number of years could take away. The next morning, they packed the van and hit the road again, toward another forgotten town, another flicker waiting to be fanned into flame. Winter had settled deep across the valley, turning rooftops white and roads into soft gray ribbons traced by tire tracks and boot prints. Frank's van rolled slowly through snow-dusted streets, heater humming, windshield wipers dragging a rhythm against the glass. His body ached more these days, the cold pressed into old joints like unwelcome memories, but something else kept him moving, the feeling that a chapter was closing, and a new one was quietly asking to be written. The Power Within project had visited over 30 communities now. Jake had begun documenting the travels with a video camera, turning clips into weekly mini-episodes. Lisa managed the emails and stories flooding in from viewers. Your dad's story made me pick up a soldering iron for the first time in years. I watched your video with my grandfather. He cried when Frank said it's never too late. But this morning, the email that arrived wasn't from a fan or a local organizer. It came from Tesla. More specifically, from a senior director in the energy division who had seen one of Jake's videos and forwarded it internally with the subject line, "This man is living our mission." The email to Frank was brief and direct. "Mr. Powers, we've followed your work. Elon has too. If you're open to it, we'd like to invite you to visit our Giga Nevada facility, meet the team, and talk about how your grassroots energy model might be integrated into future community resilience efforts. No strings attached. Just a conversation. Your story matters." T.L., Senior Director, Tesla Energy. Frank read the message twice, then again, eyes scanning for signs of a prank or misunderstanding. He even called Jake into the workshop and made him read it out loud. "Looks legit to me," Jake said, eyebrows raised. "You gonna go?" Frank didn't answer right away. He stared at the email again, the cursor blinking beneath it like a heartbeat. Part of him still didn't believe he'd earned a place in that world. Factories. Tech giants. The man whose words had sparked this whole journey. But another part of him, the one that had stepped into his garage that first uncertain night, knew exactly what he needed to do. He replied simply, "Yes. Let's talk." The trip was set for 2 weeks later. Tesla arranged the flight, accommodations, and a tour schedule. Lisa insisted on packing his suitcase for him, slipping a handwritten note into the pocket, "Don't forget who you are. Or how far you've come." The flight to Reno was smooth, quiet. Frank stared out the window most of the way, his mind wandering between anticipation and humility. Giga Nevada was a place he'd read about, watched from afar, never imagining he might one day walk its halls. As the plane descended, he felt the familiar tug of self-doubt, the same voice that once whispered, "You're too old. You don't belong." But now, after everything, he had a new answer: "I'm still here. Still building. Still becoming." The next morning, a car picked him up and drove through a sparse Nevada landscape, brown and gold and dusted with frost. And then it appeared, a silver-gray behemoth stretched across the desert floor like a spaceship had landed in the hills. Giga Nevada. One of the largest buildings in the world. As the gates opened, Frank took a slow breath. He thought about the small garage where this journey began. The difference in scale was absurd. But the intention? The spark? The same. Inside, he was greeted by a small group, engineers, program directors, a few interns nervously shaking his hand like he was the celebrity. Frank chuckled. "You know, I'm just a retired machinist with a stubborn streak, right?" One of the young engineers grinned. "Yeah, and the guy who powered a town during a blackout." They led him through the facility, giant automated lines assembling power walls, teams working on experimental battery chemistries, robots whirring past with quiet precision. It was overwhelming but beautiful, a living machine of purpose. During a lunch break, Frank was taken to a small conference room where a screen was already connected to a video call. A familiar face appeared, Elon Musk, smiling with that curious, slightly awkward warmth. "Hey, Frank," he said. "Heard a lot about you." Frank blinked. "Same here, Elon. Bit surreal, to be honest." Elon laughed. "Yeah, surreal's kind of my brand." They talked for 20 minutes. Not about fame or technology, but about community. About failure. About the strange crossroads of aging and innovation. Frank told him about May and her grandson. About Harold at the rehab center. About the nights when doubt almost won. Elon listened carefully. At one point he said, "You know, most people think change comes from institutions. But I've always believed it comes from unreasonable people who act before anyone gives them permission." Frank nodded. I stopped waiting for permission a long time ago. Elon smiled. That's why I wanted to meet you. Before they hung up, Elon added, I'm not offering anything formal today, Frank. No contract. No pitch. I just want you to know, what you're doing matters. A lot. And if there's a way Tesla can support it, the door's open. Frank thanked him, feeling something he hadn't expected, closure. Not the end of a dream, but the arrival at a place he once thought unreachable. Later that afternoon, the director showed Frank a small pilot program they were developing, kits designed to teach basic solar storage concepts in rural and senior communities. It's just an early prototype, she said. But we're thinking of calling it the Powers Pack, if you're okay with that. Frank didn't know what to say. He just nodded, overwhelmed, humbled, moved beyond words. That night, back in his hotel room, he sat at the desk and began to write. Not a letter this time. Not a guide. Just thoughts, free, grateful, and clear. It's not the name on the building that defines you. It's what you build when no one's watching. It's the people who show up. The neighbors who believe. The strangers who become family. The ones who say yes before they know how. He looked at his hands, still rough, still steady, and smiled. From machinist to mentor. From silence to spark. From faded photographs to a future glowing brighter than he ever thought possible. He closed the notebook, leaned back in the chair, and whispered, You were right, Evelyn. There was more. Then he turned off the light, knowing there was still work to do, but now, it wasn't just his legacy he was carrying. It was everyone's. And together, they were charging toward a future worth believing in. When Frank returned home from Nevada, something had shifted, not in the way he walked or the words he spoke, but in the way others looked at him. It wasn't awe or fame. It was recognition. The kind that said, You showed us what's possible. The little house on Sycamore Lane didn't change, but people came and went like it was a lighthouse. Frank didn't rest. He couldn't. There was momentum now, and he knew better than anyone how quickly momentum could fade if not honored. The Tesla trip wasn't the end of something. It was permission to go even deeper. So he did. He poured his energy into building out the Power Within curriculum into something anyone could use, whether they had a garage full of tools or just a kitchen table and curiosity. It became a printed guide, a video series, a community forum. But it wasn't just for teaching solar storage. It was about teaching purpose. The first official, Power Within, workshop launched at the county library with 12 attendees. By the third week, they had 32. By the sixth, there was a waiting list. People weren't just showing up to learn, they were showing up to remember. To remember they had something valuable to offer. Frank stood in front of the group one chilly Saturday morning, holding up an old toaster. You see this? He said. Most people would throw it out. But the minute you open it up, you realize how many moving parts are still alive in here. A little adjustment, a new spring, a tweak to the heating coil, and suddenly, it works again. You're not that different from this toaster. Laughter rippled through the room, but the truth settled deep. One by one, people started to believe it. Harold, the vet who once doubted he could contribute, now led a weekly electronics repair hour. May brought her grandson, who had since stopped breaking things and started fixing them. Lisa curated their stories into an online archive called the Spark Files, featuring photos and interviews with every person who had turned their second act into something extraordinary. This is more than a movement, she told Frank one night, scrolling through stories. It's a revolution. Quiet, kind, and overdue. Frank was proud. But he wasn't done. Not yet. In the spring, he applied for a modest grant to fund solar education in rural schools. It was approved in 3 weeks. Then came the call from the Department of Energy, We've heard about the work you're doing. Would you be willing to consult on a senior-led innovation pilot? Frank paused before answering. As long as the goal isn't to put people on a shelf after 65. I'm not here to inspire people to sit still. It's not, the rep replied. It's about showing the country what resilience really looks like. Frank accepted. But the real turning point came not from a government agency or a conference, it came from his daughter. One evening, as they sat watching the sun dip behind the trees, Lisa turned to him and asked, "You ever think about what happens after?" "After what?" he asked. "After you're not around to run this anymore. What happens to all of this? The people. The energy. The belief?" Frank looked down, quiet. He had thought about it, but in fragments, never in full. "I don't want it to be about me," he said. "That's the whole point." Lisa nodded. "Then let's build it that way." Over the next several weeks, they formed an official nonprofit, the Power Within Foundation. Its mission was simple, to help people rediscover purpose, possibility, and practical power, regardless of age. They appointed a board, diverse, experienced, passionate. The youngest was 19. The oldest, 86. Frank didn't name himself executive director. He didn't want a title. He just wanted to work. And he did. That summer, they launched community kits, boxes containing small solar panels, battery guides, tools, and inspiration journals. They were distributed to libraries, schools, senior centers, and even correctional facilities. Each box had a note inside, "This box contains more than parts. It contains permission. Use it wisely." The boxes were a hit. Stories poured in, some funny, some gut-wrenching. A woman in Nebraska fixed her front porch lights for the first time since her husband passed. A grandfather in Arizona taught 3 neighborhood kids how to wire their own solar charger. A group of retirees in West Virginia built a solar-powered irrigation system for their community garden. Frank read every story. Each one reminded him of the early days, the long nights, the self-doubt, the photo of Evelyn he carried in his wallet. But now, the stories weren't his. They belonged to a movement. To a growing symphony of second acts. One day, as he walked through the community maker space, he saw something that made him stop. It was a mural on the wall, painted by a group of local students. It showed a large tree, its roots tangled with circuit wires and batteries, its branches holding tools, books, and solar panels. Beneath it, in bold letters, "From one spark, everything grows." Frank felt a tightness in his throat. Not sadness. Not even pride. Just awe. He stepped closer and noticed something at the bottom of the tree, small names etched into the roots, names of everyone who had built this movement, from the first workshop to the newest member. And there, in the corner, in neat block letters, Evelyn P. Frank touched the paint lightly. The roots held. The tree stood tall. That night, he sat at his desk and wrote a short message. He didn't plan to send it. He just needed to write it. "Dear Evelyn, today, I saw your name on the wall of a place you never stepped inside, but helped build more than anyone. I thought this was about batteries, or energy, or even proving something to the world. But it was about one thing, keeping the light on. In others. In myself. I don't know what's next. But I do know this, the power isn't in the systems we build. It's in the people we remind they still matter. And if I go tomorrow, I'll go knowing we made something that will outlive us. Something that never ages. Something that never dims. Love, Frank." He folded the letter, slid it into the back of his journal, and exhaled. He wasn't finished yet. But he was finally at peace with whatever came next. The morning of the town's annual fair dawned clear and gold, the kind of early autumn day that smelled like baked apples and wood smoke, where the wind was crisp but not cruel, and every step crackled against leaves just beginning to fall. Frank stood in the doorway of the community center with a cup of black coffee, watching volunteers set up tents and tables. It was the first fair fully powered by solar, an idea proposed by the kids in the Power Within Junior group. They'd spent the past month running wires, checking inverters, testing battery switches. Every light bulb, every food stall, every booth ran off clean energy drawn from the storage systems Frank had helped install across rooftops, garages, and school buildings. "We're running on sunlight and second chances," Jake had said with a grin. And he was right. Frank walked the fairgrounds slowly. Not because he was tired, though at 73, the weight of time lived in his knees, but because he wanted to see everything. Remember everything. There was May, now teaching young parents how to make mini solar-powered night lights for their kids' bedrooms. Harold sat in a shaded tent with 3 local teams, all working on an open-source repair kit he'd co-designed for retired veterans. And there was Lisa, clipboard in hand, checking the battery readings from the mobile solar truck, Frank's old van, now fully retrofitted into a roaming energy education unit. She'd renamed it the Evelyn Express. Frank had pretended to groan when she told him. But his heart had swelled. He passed a table where one boy, maybe 9 or 10, was explaining to an elderly man how charge controllers worked. The boy pointed at a model and said, "You don't want to overcharge the battery, see? It's like giving too much to someone who doesn't know what to do with it. You gotta ease it in." The man laughed, delighted. "Well said, Professor." Frank smiled and kept walking. He'd spent so many years worried about endings. About running out of time, energy, chances. But walking here, among these people, surrounded by stories he helped spark, he realized something: endings are just handoffs. The power you build, you pass on. And if you've built it well, it keeps going. He stepped into the main tent for the afternoon program, where a small stage had been set up. A banner stretched above, "From one spark, celebrating purpose, power, and the people who keep the lights on." Frank hadn't agreed to speak. He didn't want the spotlight. But as the crowd began to gather, families, neighbors, local students, out-of-town visitors, he felt a gentle tap on the shoulder. "Lisa. You should say something, Dad." "Nah," Frank said softly. "It's their day now." "Exactly why you should." He looked out at the crowd. At Jake, setting up the projector. At Harold, waving his cane from the back row. At a young woman adjusting her grandmother's hearing aid. At an old man in a Tesla ball cap quietly crying, watching his daughter run a solar demo with confidence. And Frank realized, it wasn't about pride. It was about closure. And renewal. He stepped onto the stage, not to applause, but to a quiet attention that carried more weight than cheers ever could. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in. "I'm not gonna talk long," he began, his voice steady. "But I want to tell you something I learned the hard way." He paused. The microphone crackled softly. "For a long time, I thought getting older meant growing invisible. Like the world had moved on, and I missed the last train. I'd watch people half my age build, create, run, dream, and I'd think, well, that ship sailed." A few people nodded, their eyes fixed on him. But then one day, I came across a video clip of Elon Musk talking about failure. About how if something's important enough, you should try, even if the odds are against you. That hit me like a bolt. He glanced toward Lisa, then toward Jake, who had quietly turned on a screen behind him. On it played a slideshow, photos of the first Power Within workshop, the solar garage, the blackout night, the van on the road. "So I tried," Frank continued. "And it didn't start with a breakthrough. It started with a wire that sparked and a fuse that blew out my shop lights. But I kept at it. And somewhere in all that trial and error, I found something I didn't know I'd lost." He took a breath. "I found purpose." The slideshow paused on a photo of Frank sitting beside a young boy soldering a solar light together. "And here's the truth I came to tell you, especially those of you who've got more years behind you than ahead, you're not too late. You're not too old. You're not irrelevant. You're just waiting for someone, or maybe yourself, to remind you that there's still power in your hands. A long, gentle silence followed. Then applause, not explosive, but rising slowly like a wave, carried by love, respect, and gratitude. Frank stepped down and let it wash over him without needing to own it. It wasn't his anymore. It belonged to them. That evening, after the sun dipped low and the fair wound down, Frank walked back to his home alone. He passed houses with panels gleaming faintly under moonlight. He passed kids playing flashlight tag with solar lights they'd built themselves. He passed a world that now seemed a little more lit from within. Inside, he sat at the kitchen table and opened a journal. On the first page he wrote one final entry. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you leave burning. A system, a belief, a fire in someone else's belly. I thought I was building batteries. I was really building bridges, to who I was, and who others might still become. The next morning, he got up early and walked to the garage. The space was cleaner now, more organized, less frantic. But it still hummed with quiet purpose. He stood in the center, placed his hand on the workbench, and smiled. One last build, he thought. Just for the joy of it. He opened a drawer, pulled out a circuit board, and began to tinker, just as the first light of dawn poured through the window. And somewhere far away, in a factory filled with machines and minds, another battery came to life. Another idea took shape. Another older hand reached for a wire, guided by memory and motion. And another fire, maybe in a heart like yours, was waiting to be lit. The snow had melted early that year, leaving behind soggy patches of earth and the scent of thawed pine. Birds were beginning to return, chirping above the neighborhood like small, cheerful messengers of another beginning. Frank sat on his porch with a blanket across his lap, not because he was cold, but because the ritual comforted him. In one hand was his usual cup of black coffee, in the other, a letter. It wasn't an email, not a text, not a social media message. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged, the envelope bearing a return address from South Carolina. The handwriting was unfamiliar. But the name wasn't. It was from Michael, his son. Frank hadn't heard from him in almost a decade. Not since that bitter night when too many unsaid things had boiled over into silence. After Evelyn's death, Frank had buried himself in routine. Michael had drifted, distant, always moving, always too busy. Neither of them reached across the void. Until now. With a breath held longer than he intended, Frank opened the letter. Dad. I saw your name in a magazine last month. I didn't believe it at first. Then I watched the videos. The van. The town fair. Your speech. The solar kits. Everything. I guess I didn't know who you were becoming while I was stuck in who you used to be. And maybe that goes both ways. Truth is, I've been carrying a lot of weight. Blame. Regret. Anger. But when I saw that kid soldering a light beside you, I realized maybe you were never the man I thought gave up. Maybe you just didn't know how to begin again. And now you have. Maybe it's time I do, too. If you're willing, I'd like to come visit. Maybe we can start something. Michael. Frank set the letter down gently, his fingers trembling more than usual. The porch was still, the world quiet. And in that silence, his heart beat with something fragile and fierce, hope. 2 weeks later, Michael pulled into the driveway in a silver rental car. He stepped out slowly, cautiously, as if unsure how to enter the past without shattering it. Frank rose from his chair and walked forward. They stared at each other for a long moment. Time had carved lines into both their faces, but something familiar still lived behind their eyes. You look older, Michael said, a wry smile tugging at his mouth. So do you, Frank replied, voice cracking just enough to be honest. They didn't hug right away. They just stood there, breathing in the fact that this moment existed. Then Michael reached into the trunk and pulled out a box. "I brought something," he said. "Not much. Just an idea." Inside the box were 3 small lithium cells, a broken flashlight, and a printed outline for a solar-powered trail light designed for backcountry hikers. Frank raised an eyebrow. "You building now?" Michael shrugged. "I've been hiking more. Getting away from screens. I thought, maybe if people could light their path with something they built themselves, they'd walk it differently." Frank nodded, something lighting behind his eyes. "Let's build it, then." And just like that, father and son walked into the garage, not to fix the past, but to forge something new. Over the next few days, they worked side by side. There were no long apologies, no dramatic breakthroughs. Just movement. Tools passed hand to hand. Designs adjusted. Late-night coffee. Awkward laughter. And slowly, old patterns began to crumble. Frank watched Michael work and realized something unexpected. His son had grown into a man who cared deeply about people, about systems, about simplicity and sustainability. Maybe he had always been that man, buried beneath their silence. Michael, for his part, saw his father not as the gruff, unreachable man of his youth, but as someone who had kept going long after it made sense. Someone who had turned grief into light. Literally. One afternoon, Lisa stopped by with sandwiches and froze when she saw Michael at the workbench. Her voice trembled. "You came back." He stood, uncertain. "Yeah. I did." She walked up and embraced him with the fierceness of 10 missing years. Frank looked away, eyes glistening. They spent that evening around the old dining room table, swapping stories and plans. Michael talked about wanting to start a hiking club that repaired gear for underprivileged kids. Lisa shared updates on the Power Within Foundation's latest expansion into retirement communities. And then, over apple pie, Michael asked the question Frank never thought he'd hear. "Do you think I could take the van for a while? Drive it south. Maybe bring some kits to the rural campsites. Places off-grid. Show people what's possible." Frank didn't hesitate. "She's yours. Just promise me something." Michael leaned in. "Anything. Don't just deliver power," Frank said. "Deliver belief." That night, as Michael drove off with the Evelyn Express humming down the highway, Frank stood on the porch, his heart full. He wasn't saying goodbye to his son. He was sending him forward. In the weeks that followed, Michael sent postcards instead of texts. One from the Smoky Mountains. Gave a talk at a ranger station. 2 retirees want to build a solar shower system. Working with them next week. One from Louisiana. Bayou community taught me more than I taught them. Built a light system for a fishing dock. They cried when it worked. I cried, too. One from Texas. Met a widower who hadn't spoken to anyone in years. Now he runs a weekly solar and supper club. Cooking and wiring. Who knew? Frank pinned each card to the garage wall. One night, he sat alone with a stack of fresh mail, donation letters, foundation inquiries, invitations to speak. But one envelope was different. Hand-addressed. Heavy. He opened it to find a letter from Elon Musk himself. Frank. I've been following the progress. What started as a spark in your garage has turned into a distributed energy network powered not by solar alone, but by purpose. You've built what most engineers dream of but few achieve, not just technology that works, but people who believe in using it to change lives. We'd like to feature your story in Tesla's annual impact report. Not because it's flashy, but because it's real. The future you're building reminds us that innovation doesn't belong to the young. It belongs to the bold. Stay powered. Stay stubborn. Elon. Frank set the letter down and smiled. He didn't need fame. But it felt good to know the work mattered. Later that week, the Power Within Foundation held its largest summit yet, nearly 400 attendees, some in wheelchairs, others with walkers, others bounding with the energy of youth. Every one of them had come because someone like Frank had lit a spark. Frank sat in the back row this time. He didn't want the stage. He watched as May gave the keynote. As Harold introduced a team of teen inventors. As Michael appeared on the big screen via satellite from New Mexico, talking about the future of legacy power design. Frank clapped until his hands ached. At the end, Lisa surprised him with a plaque. It read, "Frank Powers, founder of the Fire. A life wired for light." Frank didn't cry. But something in him exhaled fully, deeply, completely. As the lights dimmed and people left, he stood in the now empty hall, hands in his pockets, and whispered to the dark. "Not bad for a retired machinist." Then he smiled, turned, and walked toward the door, toward whatever was next. It was quiet in the house now. Not silent in a sad way, but peaceful, like the soft hum of a well-built machine. The garage door creaked open every morning, the coffee pot still burbled its reliable gurgle at 6:15 a.m., and Frank's boots still sat by the back door, worn down at the heels, just the way he liked them. But things had changed, too. The world outside his window had taken notice. The Power Within Foundation now had programs in 17 states. The solar education kits were part of science curricula in dozens of public schools. His face had appeared on a national news segment, then on a magazine cover, then on a billboard in Times Square. But Frank didn't care much for any of that. What mattered were the letters. Hundreds of them. Stacked in neat piles in the corner of the workshop, tied with twine and smelling faintly of ink and purpose. Letters from a grandmother who installed her own rooftop panel after watching one of his videos. From a retired coal miner who started a solar co-op in West Virginia. From a prison inmate who taught fellow inmates to rewire discarded battery banks using knowledge learned from the Powers Pack. Every letter ended the same way. "I thought I was done. But I wasn't. Thank you." Frank never replied to all of them. He couldn't. But he read each one. Word for word. Slowly. Reverently. Because those words meant more than any award. He was sitting in the garage that afternoon, wiping dust from an old voltmeter, when Lisa walked in. She held a letter of her own. "It came today," she said. Frank took it from her hands. The return address was from Austin. From Michael. He opened it with the same mix of pride and nerves that had become familiar. "Dad. Thought you'd want to know, we finished the trail grid. 42 miles of solar markers through the national forest. Hikers won't get lost at night now. We named the system, Powers Path. Not for the name. For what it stands for. I brought the last marker out myself. Hiked it up the ridge at sunrise. The final switch on. I stood there for a while after. Thinking about you. About Evelyn. About how much light one person can leave behind if they just keep moving. I'm starting a family, Dad. Her name's Natalie. She's amazing. And she believes in all this just as much as I do. I want our kids to grow up in a world where people know their power. Where age isn't a reason to stop, but a reason to teach. A reason to begin. I hope I've made you proud. Love, Michael." Frank read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and slid it into the journal Evelyn had once given him. The pages were worn thin now, filled with sketches, notes, and pieces of himself he hadn't realized were worth saving. Lisa sat beside him. "He's building his own legacy," she said softly. Frank nodded. "That's the whole point." Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard. The solar panels on the garage roof caught the light just right, glowing warm as if nodding in approval. Frank leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The ache in his knees had grown sharper this year. The doctor said he needed to slow down. Everyone said that. But Frank had learned something most people never do, that motion is life. It didn't have to be fast. It didn't even have to be physical. But you had to move. Forward. Outward. Inward. Somehow. So he kept moving. One quiet evening, he did something he hadn't done in years. He walked down the road to the community center, just as the sun dipped low and the windows began to glow with warm light. Inside, a new group of learners gathered around tables cluttered with wires and tools. A younger man led the session, a second-generation teacher trained through the foundation. Frank stayed in the back, just watching. The instructor held up a small solar panel and said, "You might think this is about electricity. But it's not. It's about story. About choice. About remembering that the most powerful circuit you'll ever build is the one that reconnects you to your own belief." Frank smiled. The words were different, but the message? The same. He turned to leave, but a woman near the door recognized him. "Mr. Powers?" He stopped. "Yes." She held out a small, handheld light. "My father built this using one of your kits. He passed last year. But this? It still works. I keep it by my bed every night. I think it was the first thing he'd built in over 30 years. Frank looked down at the light, his heart full. "He left behind a lot," she added. "Not stuff. Meaning." Frank took her hand, gently. He gave the world something it needed. "That's more than most people ever get to say." She nodded. "So did you." He walked home under the stars, feeling not older, but charged. Not at the end, but at the edge of something timeless. In the weeks that followed, he found himself spending less time building and more time writing, capturing the journey, the lessons, the transformations. He called it the Long Circuit Home, a collection of stories not about invention, but reinvention. Not about changing the world, but remembering you still can. One day, Lisa stopped by with a copy of the first printing. "It's beautiful," she said. "We're going to use it in workshops." Frank held it in his hands, surprised by how light it felt, like it had already passed through him and now belonged to the world. On the dedication page, she'd added a quote of his. "You're not too late. You're just waiting for someone, or something, to remind you that you're still needed." Frank didn't say much. He didn't need to. That night, as the sky darkened and the stars blinked awake one by one, Frank went out to the garage one last time. He opened the breaker box, checked the circuits, and smiled. Still steady. Still alive. He flipped the main switch off. Then on. The system clicked, then hummed. The lights across the property came to life. The porch. The walkway. The little lamp on Evelyn's bench beneath the tree. And Frank stood there, alone but never lonely, watching the glow ripple out across the yard, into the road, into the night. This wasn't a goodbye. It was a handoff. A relay of belief. A final switch on. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?